Well, I am Pablo Pérez Castelló. I'm the 2022-2024 postdoctoral research fellow in animal ethics at Queen's University, where I work with Professor Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson. First thing, thank you very much again. I just want to say what Ola said to the Brooks Institute for funding this fantastic conference, and to all the organizers. I love it. This conference is my second and one of my favorites. So thank you so much. You. As the previous talks, David will speak for around 45 minutes, perhaps slightly less.
Less.
Slightly less. And, I will ask a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor to all the Q&A that David told me is the part that he's looking forward the most. So please ask many questions and as provocative as you want. I know David really likes to just have a chat, so let's do that. And then, well, David Peña-Guzmán, our speaker for today, he's Associate Professor of Humanities at San Francisco State University. He specializes in animal studies, the history and philosophy of science, French philosophy, theories of consciousness. He's the author of When Animals Dream, The Hidden World of Animal Consciousness, and co-author of Chimpanzee Rights, The Philosopher's Dream. He's also co-host of the philosophy podcast Overthink. I also wanted to show you the cover. It's so beautiful. And as soon as you open it, I don't know if you can see it, guys. Can you see, perhaps some of you here, how it goes, the colors? That's because octopuses, when they dream, the colors change a lot of the octopuses. So hence this idea, and that's what David is going to talk to us about today. And I wanted to say, just very briefly, given that this is the last talk of the day, that I found a sort of thread between different talks and David's. So Christine, at some point, Andrews, I remember that she mentioned that animals are not just beings who suffer and experience happiness. They are also very complex beings that have social norms and all sorts of other things. And Becca Franks also asked an interesting question I found about whether we should try to prove that poor environments for rats kind of makes them, in terms of welfare, they might feel bad and so on, or whether we should try to see in settings that are very rich, how the animals flourish, whether we should focus on these aspects. I mention that because what I have seen in these talks is that some authors nowadays are concerned with illuminating the complex and rich lives of animals. They are not just sentient in a way, they are much more than that. And I see David's work as kind of contributing to illuminate that animals dream, and as he says in the book, animals too dream their way to freedom. So I love that quote from the book, and that's what David's going to talk us about today. So please join me in welcoming David.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that people can hear. I don't know yet how to modulate my voice for people in the back. Is that okay? Okay, great. And I was told that I have to stand at an awkward angle here to avoid the light and at the same time have space for my notes. So if you see me somewhat struggling, that's the reason why. And so thanks to the people who organized the conference and to everybody who is here. And I know this is the last talk after a long day of thinking. Just please don't fall asleep during the talk about dreaming. I don't think I could handle that. I will talk today about the dreams of animals, which is the subject of a book that I published this past year with Princeton University Press. And in this work, I explore the significance of animal dreaming using a combination of scientific research on animal cognition as well as philosophical analysis. And as you'll see, my background as a professional philosopher really shines through more so than my non-existent background as a scientist. So this is very much a philosopher's take on the animal mind. Now, in this book, I begin by classifying scientific evidence that we have for thinking that animals do indeed have these inner reality simulations that we call dreams into two categories. We have what are known as oniric behaviors, and oniric behaviors comes from the Greek root oneiros, which means simply dreams or dreaming in ancient Greek. And oniric behaviors are those behaviors that we observe during the sleep cycle of various species that are indicative of some inner reality occurring in the life of the animal. So here we're thinking about what's happening at the level of the body. What are the animals doing with their limbs? Are they making grimaces? Are they making vocalizations? So on and so forth. And we also have electrophysiological data that reveals something about the kind of brain activity, the brain activation patterns that are happening at the same time. So typically oniric behaviors will also match particular neural signatures that together will tell a story about what's happening in these animals as they travel through their sleep cycle. And so that's what the book is about. It's about joining animals on this journey, this nocturnal journey for animals that sleep during the night, diurnal one for those that sleep during the day, in which they leave the world of conscious awareness and enter this very bizarre, topsy-turvy world, which is the dream world. Now, let's begin by thinking about the first of these categories, which are the oniric behaviors. Take the case of cuttlefish. Now, cuttlefish are closely related to octopuses. They are cephalopods that have, like us, a biphasic sleep cycle. And biphasic just means that their sleep cycle is divided into two clearly identifiable phases. There is a period of relatively low activity, both at the level of the body and at the level of neural activation, during which not much is happening for these animals. You can think of this as deep sleep. In connection to cuttlefish in particular, this is called a period of quiescence, general universal quiescence for the organism, where everything just sort of shuts down. But at some point in the sleep cycle, there is a switch that happens. And these animals transition from a period of low activation, again, both body and mind, to periods of fast activity where you start seeing the body start getting recruited into something like an inner program, and also various forms of activation at the level of the chromatophoric system. And that's where you see the connection, if I can see the book for a second, between octopuses and cuttlefish in terms of their reliance on this particular, on their chromatophoric system, which is one way in which they externalize experiences. Now, I have it here. Now, what you're going to see here, and I know this is quite difficult to see because these are shots of a scientific journal publication. I don't have access to the original recording or to the photographs, but what you have here is frames of a video recording of a cuttlefish during a period of fast activity during sleep. And what you see is an animal changing its chromatophoric system over 30 seconds, over the period of half a minute. And I'll try to talk to you through some of the changes. Hopefully you can see it a little bit, even though I know it's somewhat pixelated. Now, if you follow the changes in this animal, what you see is, and here you have the cuttlefish, the 4 shots. It's facing this way. Here are the eyes, and the body. And what you see as you move down the timeline are a couple of changes that stand out. First, you see a darkening of the entire body plan. Light, dark, light, beginning to darken once more. So the animal is pulsating in terms of its coloration. Second change that we notice is the emergence of what is known in the case of cuttlefish as the square display. And that is on the back of the body. You see right here in particular, the emergence of a white square. I don't know if people can see that from the back. That doesn't exist in the same way in the top, in the middle, or in the bottom. But again, something that emerges and disappears and is defined by its own evanescence. Finally, you see the emergence of an eye bar. As things are moving down, you see the eye coloration also change. Now, here, because this is black and white and it's kind of difficult to appreciate the colors, here is a cuttlefish and the kind of coloration that you would actually expect to see if you were looking at these animals. Here we have a different pattern, a chromatophoric pattern that is not the white square. This is known as a zebra display, but it's just a way for me to visualize what the other one would have looked like with a different distribution of shapes and colors. Now, the point that I make in the book, and I begin by telling a story about octopuses, I then move on to talking about cuttlefish, and I, after that, move to talking about a variety of other animals for which we also have reasons to believe that they have a rich inner dream life. Take the case of chimpanzees. In the 1990s, Kimberly Mukabe found that chimpanzees who have been taught ASL, American Sign Language, this is a very common language protocol in primatology in the late 20th century, she found that chimpanzees that had learned ASL would begin signing, they would begin making ASL signs in the middle of their sleep cycle. In particular, during the phase of their sleep cycle during which they entered their own version of REM, which is rapid eye movement, which in the case of mammals is the period of the sleep cycle during which we're statistically most likely to dream. So when they enter this really important state of sleep or phase of sleep, the animals began signing in a very controlled way ASL symbols without an addressee. So, right, they were asleep, they were withdrawn from the external world, and yet they were conveying something outwardly. Now, this suggests not only that these animals are dreaming, but that their dreams are likely to regularly include communicative and therefore social dynamics because of the communicative, obviously, and also social nature of language, in this case, ASL. They are dreaming of chatting with other humans and with other chimpanzees because usually once a chimpanzee learns ASL, they use it not just to communicate with the humans who taught it to them, but they also start using it to communicate with other chimpanzees. So among themselves, this becomes a way of sharing information about the immediate physical and social environment. Now, let me make one parenthetical notation here, or observation. I'll make two over the course of the talk. And that is that in contemporary theories of dreaming, especially in the scientific world, I'm here talking about evolutionary theory and cognitive psychology, whenever scientists agree that there is a possibility that animals could dream, and that's not always the case, I can talk about that during the Q&A session, whenever they grant that possibility, they usually make the claim that what animals dream of are evolutionarily significant scenarios that probably don't vary a lot from individual to individual. So for example, if you are prey species, you probably will have these archaic dreams of being chased by a predator because the idea is that the function of dreams from an evolutionary perspective is to allow the animal to enact a kind of simulation during sleep so that in the case that situation becomes real in the real world, they'll be ready to enact the right kind of behavioral program to survive, right? So if I am let's say, gazelle, and I dream of being chased by a lion, and I go through that program every night, when it happens, my chances of survival are going to go up. Now, the assumption behind that idea is that there is no individual to individual variation in the content of the dreams of animals. And the parenthetical observation that I want to make here is that in thinking about the case of these chimpanzees, we find a refutation of this claim. Why? Because ASL, of course, is not an evolutionary reality for these organisms. It is something that was introduced by humans. It is something that they learn over the course of their lives. And it means that the dreams of these animals reflect not only their evolutionary past, but also their personal experiences as individuals, meaning that the content of the dreams of animals is largely tailored to the particular individual that we're dealing with. And so this is a point that I emphasize in the book again and again, the importance of thinking about non-human experience, not only in terms of variables like species membership, but also variables like the individuality, the radical individuality of each animal. Not just gazelles, let's say with a capital G, but this gazelle, that gazelle over there. Now, so as to not get lost in the weeds here too much in the details, let me note that in the book I talk about a lot of other species beyond the ones that I've just mentioned. So for example, I talk about dreaming in zebrafish. So there are fish in the book that appear. There are also zebra finches, which are birds. I'll say something about them in a minute. I talk quite a bit also about cats and dogs for obvious reasons. We know quite a lot about them by virtue of our relationship to them. But I also talk about other animals like the platypus, and a lot in the book is also dedicated to the dream worlds of rats. And that's just because we happen to know more about the nervous systems of rats more than about virtually any other animal because of their role in scientific research, because they are the animal that we use the most to model all kinds of conditions in laboratory settings. Now, from all of this, I keep misplacing the clicker. Now, from all this research, I draw the conclusion that, as I put it in the book, endogenous dream sequences must be much more widespread throughout the animal kingdom than previously imagined, extending across seemingly impassable evolutionary distances. And all of this is only on the basis of the behavioral evidence. But as I mentioned earlier, in the book, I also spent a lot of time talking about electrophysiological data that sheds light on brain activation patterns. And I focus in particular on what scientists call mental replay. Mental replay is a complex neuronal event that occurs while animals are taking their Z's, and that is a particularly good indicator of non-human dream phenomenology. This kind of replay has been recorded in many vertebrates, including mammalian and non-mammalian species. For example, zebra finches, whom I just mentioned, replay their song, which is an important part of their social and cultural lives, while they are asleep, especially again during that version of their sleep cycle that we can call REM sleep. So we know that zebra finches, in order for them to master their song, they have to practice it. It's not innate. It's something that is cultural, that is passed horizontally, and that the animals have to develop a mastery for through training. And for a while, some scientists have wondered whether that kind of memorization labor that goes into really mastering that song maybe is aided by the role of sleep in memory consolidation. And the interesting thing is that it's not just sleep that helps consolidate these memories, it's actually dreaming about the song itself. It is the conscious experience of singing, of rehearsing that song when these animals are asleep. And so what we know, based on electrophysiological studies, is that practicing the song triggers a very specific neural dynamic, a very specific neural signature in these animals. And that exact signature reappears during REM sleep. And so you see the reappearance of what we know to be associated with a socially and psychologically significant behavior during the waking state. Again, this practice of singing a song in order to better interact with those around me. Mental replay has also been discovered in rats. In fact, this is where the concept really is developed. Rats replay spatial tasks during sleep. They will mentally reconstruct their physical surroundings in such great detail that scientists nowadays can tell which position in a dreamt maze, so I'll repeat that. Scientists can tell which position in a dreamt maze a rat is in during their sleep cycle simply by looking at nothing but their neural activation patterns. And that's just because of how much we know about the rat hippocampus and the memory system. Now, as I mentioned before, I myself am not a scientist. I am a philosopher. And I am a philosopher interested in animal consciousness. And I believe that especially this research on mental replay raises fascinating philosophical questions about the animal mind. It raises really interesting questions about the nature of memory, for example, since animals cannot replay episodes, i.e. dreams of scenes from their past, if they have not previously stored those episodes in something like a memory bank. So here we're talking about the creation of short and long-term memory archives in the animal that then become the basis for the creation or the formation of a particular dream. We dream of things typically that have happened to us. And so dreaming already points to the existence of memory. It also raises questions about the nature of non-human imagination, since animals, when they dream, reconstruct an episode from past experience, and this is the key point to underline, in the absence of any relevant stimuli in their present environment that is related to the episode in question. So for example, if I dream about my 10th birthday party, there is nothing in my objective surroundings that is connected to that episode in my life. So the act of recalling it happens without the guidance of the external world. And this act of recalling something without the aid of the external world is a form of imagination. It is a kind of reproductive imagination where I reproduce an episode from past experience. So just think about how cognitively complex that act is, of reaching back into my past in order to relive something in the present that is not connected to what's happening around me. Moreover, we know that some animals do not simply dream by recalling past experiences. They also sometimes invent new experiences in the context of dreaming. And so dreaming is not just memory recall. Sometimes it's the creation and the production of novel experiences that the animal has never encountered before. And I can talk about some of the research that I use for thinking about this during the Q&A session, but there is some fascinating work on hippocampal cells and their role in spatial mapping, and how, in particular, in the case of rats, these animals in their dreams can create or imagine new spatial possibilities that are not parts of their physical environment, and they imagine the act of traversing those imaginary spaces. And so here, a clearly imaginative mental capacity. In the book, I also talk about the nature of animal desire and the questions that this research on mental replay raises in connection to it. Now, when I submitted my book for publication, I got some pushback from the science editorial team at Princeton for my use of the word desire. And they said, "Are you sure this is the word you want to use?" And I dug in my heels and I said, yes, this is exactly the word that I want to use for thinking about the kind of motivation, the interested motivation that we see at work in the case of animal dreams. And my claim here about animal desire, and I do think about desire, this is a largely psychoanalytic take on desire, but as a kind of lack that moves you. You know, you're drawn towards something that you want to appropriate or incorporate because you do not have it in the moment. And you judge that lack to be a problem for yourself. And my thinking about animal desire is based on a 2015 article by a group of scientists at the University College London in the UK. Here, let me paint a quick picture for you. Let me make sure. Yes, we are in the section on desire. So researchers introduced rats to a maze that they could explore. Very simple protocol in rat cognitive research. Except that there was a wing of the maze that the rats could look at, because there was a transparent barrier. They could look at this branch of the maze, but they could not physically explore it. And just to give you a little bit more detail on how this research was done, it was based on a T-shaped maze where the animals had access to the primary corridor. They could move up and down, And when they got to the junction, there was that transparent barrier, and they could look to the right and to the left, but they could not actually go into the little arms of the T-shaped maze. The researchers then decided to motivate one wing of the maze. And motivate here means that they introduced an object of desire for the rats. In this case, they used a pile of rice that rats like. And so by the time the rats start looking at what's happening in the maze, they realize that there's something over here that they're looking at that they want, but that they cannot access because of the barrier. What happened was that when the rats were awake and they were exploring the maze, when they got to the junction of the maze, and there were recordings of brain activity happening as this is going on, they began mentally projecting the act of exploring the maze with the yummy snack. In other words, they would get to the maze, they would look, and they would mentally imagine and go through the mental steps of getting to the maze. Like, what would I do? What would I have to do in order to get that reward? So they would actually implement, at the level of the imaginary, the behavioral program needed to acquire the object of desire. Now, what happened next was that when the rats were taken out of the maze, and remember, their desire was frustrated because that barrier was there. So now you have these rats that know that there is a snack, but they are frustrated in their desire for the snack. When they're taken out of the maze and they're allowed to rest, the rats fell asleep, and the electrophysiological recordings continued. When they fell asleep, they began to enact, in their sleep cycle, the same imaginary motor program for attaining the desired rice. So they began dreaming of getting to this forbidden part of the maze. In the book, I note, let me see if, sorry. So this is the article in question here. Hippocampal play cells construct reward-related sequences through unexplored space. A mouthful for what I just said. And in the book, I note that this discovery about the way in which desire motivates and affects the formation of dreams in the case of rats, I know that this research means that we may need to bring contemporary research in the animal sciences, especially in the realm of cognition, in closer dialogue with Freud's psychoanalytic theory of dreams. And the reason for this is because, at least in the case of rats, dreams are, in fact, imaginary realizations of otherwise truncated desires. Here we have a case of Freudian wish fulfillment in a non-human animal, with dreams fulfilling a desire that the reality principle in the waking state prevents us from fulfilling. And so even though, of course, the term psychoanalysis in the scientific community tends to have a negative association, there are a number of people now, especially in the field of affective neuroscience, trying to bring together contemporary neuroscientific research into closer dialogue with Freudian psychoanalysis, especially the psychoanalytic theories of dreams. Now, from this research on replay, a curious image starts to emerge of animal dreams as mixes of memory, imagination, and desire, which is to say, as mixtures between past, future, and present. And if that is correct, dreams reveal hitherto unimagined depths in the mental lives of other species. As I write at the end of the chapter on consciousness in the book, it is hard, oh, well, you should have been seeing this the whole time, but sorry. So as I mentioned in the book, it is hard to deny that dreams push us to new frontiers in the study of animal consciousness. Frontiers where the lines between the human and the non-human, the existential and the biological, the transcendent and the immanent begin to blur. Now, let me conclude here with a final note on ethics, and this will only be a very brief observation. Although this book is primarily about the minds of other species, it is motivated ultimately by moral concerns. I believe that the dreams of other Earthlings are meaningful not only because they make us wonder about the mental powers of other animals, but also because they crystallize the moral status of non-human dreamers. In the final chapter of the book, I contend that dreams have what I call a moral force that I have not seen articulated anywhere in the literature, and that grants any creature who dreams what ethicists call moral status. And of course, moral status is a foundational concept in moral theory that tracks those creatures who are bearers of moral, and perhaps by extension, legal, rights or entitlements. Again, I present this here only as a teaser for reasons of time, but the moral ramifications of animal dreaming would lead to significant changes in human-animal relations, shifting how we think about, perceive, and treat the other dreamers of this world, hopefully for the better. Thank you. I don't know how much time it was. Okay.
Thank you so much, David. That was absolutely excellent. Let me take the mic. Get your water. Okay. So, as you know, we already talked about this, David. I have a couple of questions, and the first question I wanted to ask was one of my favorite aspects of the book. I just thought that you guys, the audience, you should not miss this part, and David has touched on it, but not explicitly. So one of these central contributions is the study of animal consciousness while animals are asleep. And there has been quite a bit of research on animal consciousness while they are awake. But you say that there are two advantages related to focusing on the study of animal consciousness while they sleep. So could you please explain a little bit what are these advantages? I thought it was really clever and important. So, yeah.
Yeah, so of course, there's a lot of research about animal cognition, animal behavior. And most of that research looks at what animals do when they're awake, when they're alert, when they're interacting with their environment in flexible and intelligent ways. And it seemed to me when I began thinking about this topic that we might be missing an entire dimension of animal experience that happens outside of that typical frame. And we know that there are many different kinds of mental states in other animals. And so I decided to try to pursue one of those, and those are dreams. And the thing about dreams is that they are endogenous, meaning that they are generated from within. Again, it's that divorce from the external world. So it is a kind of experience, and there are similarities to waking experience, but dreams are unlike waking experience in very noticeable ways. And so one of those differences is precisely that it is the illumination of a world of experience for an animal that doesn't reflect the material realities of the external objective world, right? So when you dream of something, you are imagining a fictitious scenario, but you experience it as if it were real. So you are producing something endogenously, and that endogenously created world engulfs you and becomes sort of the world that you inhabit in that moment. And so the value of thinking about animal experience and animal consciousness beginning from this non-typical mental state are two that I talk about in the book. One of them is simply that it helps us, let's say, deepen our appreciation for the complexity of the animal mind. I think here we really see this sense of awe or wonder at what the minds of animals can accomplish if they also produce these fictitious worlds that envelop them. But the second benefit of thinking about the animal mind by looking at dreams is much more strategic. And that is what I talk about in the book in terms of the behaviorist objection, which is a term that I made up to talk about an argument that I think most people here are very familiar with, that comes from skeptics of animal consciousness. And the general idea is that with animals, you don't have any rich inner mental reality. You just have cause and effect relationships triggered by external stimuli. So, something is hot, animal moves away. We don't impute or attribute any mental states as mediating factors. And this is a basic principle of behaviorist psychology, that the mind of animals is a dead end from the beginning. Because you can always explain things as brute reactions. That's the key part of that objection. And the thing about dreams is that because dreams are already clearly divorced from the external world by the physiology of sleep, the fact that our eyes are closed, we recede into this inner sanctuary, that kind of objection becomes unsustainable, right? So when an animal is dreaming of singing its song or is dreaming of traveling a maze, it's very difficult to make the argument that they're just mechanically reacting to the demands of the external world, because that's the whole point. They're not responding to the external world at all. And so you need to give a very different explanation of what you're observing. And I think that short circuits that very common objection to animal consciousness. And so I think this is one benefit, that a purely behaviorist reading of dreams is untenable. And so it gives us some weapons, I guess you could say, for painting a more complex, more vibrant picture of the animal mind.
Can you hear me well at the end? Yes, that's good. Wasn't that so smart? When I read it, I thought, how good is that? So you had to hear. Yes, so my second question will be slightly longer. I need to explain a bit more. It's an observation, perhaps slightly more critical. Although I think we agree. So I'm still trying to figure out where are we situated, each of us. So, of course, the book focuses on different kinds of consciousness: subjective, affective, and metacognitive. And there is also the phrase that animals are like us, and that you conduct research or you focus on aspects of animals because they are like us. Made me think of a critique in the literature that authors like Matthew Calarco and Manisha Dekka as well, in Animals as Legal Beings, who people might be more familiar with Manisha Dekka's work. They try to suggest that when we have an idea of the paradigmatic human person, or this ideal of the human as a rational being who is a man, independent, very intelligent, sophisticated, intellectually speaking, it's all in the head, as it were, instead of being more embodied, perhaps. So they say this is a problem, because when we look at, for instance, you have done work on this yourself, David, the field of disability studies, and we look at why discriminations happen. What we find is that those beings who deviate from this paradigmatic human person, we discriminate against them because they are not like us. Like us, meaning that us is this ideal of the human as an independent, rational being, and so on, right? Not irrational, like people who are deprived of reason. That is how people with cognitive disabilities are often portrayed or depicted, as it were. So one of the things that one could say to kind of reverse this tendency is to put an emphasis on difference. So to value different body types, different ways to inhabit the world, different ways of being, different ways to experience gender as well, different ways to, different cosmologies, if we move to the indigenous studies kind of literatures. So I know you've done work yourself. You have an excellent article that I also recommend to everyone, entitled "The Harm of Ableism" in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal. I really enjoyed reading this piece as well. And you told me, because this approach I mentioned right now, I explained with certain length, is often labeled as the sameness approach or the sameness logic. And you told me, I don't really endorse that. So I was just wondering, how can we situate your work? How would you respond to this perhaps potential objection in the book? Yes, that's perhaps my question. I hope that was more or less clear.
So you're right that often advocates for animal rights and for animal welfare will make their case hinge on the establishing of parallels between humans and animals, beginning with the human case by default, and then trying to see to what extent animals can be folded into whatever capacities we valorize about ourselves. And typically, the capacities or the traits of human experience that get centralized in these discussions are those that make up that abstract image of the rational human. And we know that historically, because of the way in which that's been coded, that often has other attributes built into it. We're talking about a white male. There is a long history here of how that concept actually plays out in practice. Now, in the book, I do use the phrase "like us" multiple times. But you're right that I don't take myself to be following the sameness approach. And the reason for this, I think there are a couple, so let me try to clarify them to myself in my head before I speak. I think one main difference has to do with the relationship between that abstraction, that collective cultural abstraction that we have of the rational human, and the figure of humanity that emerges when you look at something like dreams. So the thing about dreams is that they actually do not quite fit into the view of the rational human, because dreams are not rational, right? They, if anything, are deeply irrational, and they're also deeply affective. So in the world of dreams, things that get foregrounded more are emotions, the body, unreason, whatever we might call that, which are precisely the features that get excluded from that abstraction. And so in making the claim that animals like us dream, or dream like us, I'm actually foregrounding features of human experience that have been devalued by that history of humanist, androcentric, Eurocentric thinking. And so that's one thing. The second thing is that the thing about difference and sameness is that you can't have one without the other. They're kind of the same and different together. And the reason I say that is because once we recognize that other animals are also dreamers, that's not the end of the discussion. In fact, that's just the beginning. If we think about just the structure of the book, the way I conceived it, chapter 1 tries to defend the claim that other animals dream. But the reason that that's chapter 1 is, again, because that only is the precondition for the start of the philosophical analysis, which is, well, but then what is the significance of this? And the significance of that for me is that it does open up onto a horizon of difference. Because other animals may dream, but they will have fundamentally ahuman or inhuman dreams. Animals will have their own dreams. They will not dream in the same way that we dream, for the simple reason that their worlds of experience are already constituted in different ways. Their Umwelt follows its own logic and does not mirror our own. So just to give maybe a concrete example here, think about the sensory capabilities of different animals. We know that animals live in different phenomenal worlds. For some, smell is more important. For some, tact or touch is more important. And it's very likely that the dream worlds of different animals will be constituted in the same way that their waking worlds are. So we know that in the case of human dreams, our dreams tend to be dominated by vision for the most part, with some exceptions. But rarely do human dreamers report smells, for example, in their dream recall. It's mostly hearing and vision. But when you switch from humans to, let's say, dogs, for whom olfactory perception is much more important, then you're talking about, arguably, a fundamentally olfactory dream, a dream that is constituted according to a logic that is not human. The same thing with the zebra finches. Zebra finches probably have acoustic dreams. And so the reason that I want to distance myself from the notion of sameness is because I do think that we need to respect the difference that marks different species and different individual animals, which is why I underlined that at the beginning. And for me, this goes in a different direction, so I won't develop this point. But for me, in connection to the ethics discussion that comes at the end of the book, for me, the foundation of ethics really is difference, right? When you encounter a different life form, what makes you feel like you are morally accountable to that life form is precisely that it strikes you as errantly unlike you, and therefore as deserving something like moral respect.
That was fantastic. I love your response. You convinced me. The only thing, just a tiny remark, and I would like to know what your take on this. It's just, because I've been thinking, maybe it's just the discourse. Just a discursive shift that Matthew Calarco proposes, which is to think of in what ways are humans like animals? In what ways are we like them? Instead of, and this does not mean, of course, erasing difference. It also opens up horizons, as you were mentioning. So I wonder whether you would find that it would resonate perhaps with what you are saying, because sometimes it's just the use of, I was thinking, maybe I was just reading it or misreading it because of this phrase, like us, that's all. Would you?
Yeah, I'll do Control F and change like us to like them. But yeah, it is true that maybe even that small change, not to minimize it, I think it could be powerful to shift the way we talk about our relationship to other animals, and to think about the project not as the extension of a certain capacity that we have to other animals as if it were some act of charity or benevolence, but rather as tracing an animal trait and seeing how it plays out in very different branches of the tree of animal life. And so if we think about that, I think that kind of turns what would be a vertical way of thinking into a more horizontal way of thinking.
I love that. So thank you so much. I'm very convinced by this, and I'm really happy that I asked this question because I read the book twice and it was on my head, and now I know, get it. So yes, so please, questions. So I open the floor to all of you. We have already a few hands here. Let me see on the back, please, on the left-hand side. We have 3 questions there, so perhaps the 3 of you can ask the questions, one by one maybe, and then.
Oh, sure.
Whoever
wants. We're all fighting back here, David. Just so you know. Thank you for that presentation. That's really great. Thanks also for the framing through offline use or offline sleep patterns, because that's actually. You're right that there's something philosophical to explore as you move from online behavioral patterns to offline behavioral patterns, and I think that's actually really interesting. I'm very interested in 4E cognition approaches to cognition, so extended, enacted, embedded, embodied. And one of the things that interests me about the 4E cognition approaches is they're trying to move away from representational rich modeling of minds. It doesn't matter what species, humans included, because there's a great deal of emerging skepticism about the level of representational language we use to talk about behavior and, for want of a better word, cognitively based behavior. Just the cognition doesn't have to translate to high representational content, doesn't matter again about species. And so I'm just wondering how that plays here in this space. And so I'm wondering if you've given any thought to 4E cognitive approaches to dreaming, what that would look like, again, regardless of species. Because, again, the influence of the 4E approach is to dampen representational talk. And you're using a lot of representational language. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about, if you take a 4E cognition approach to this, what that would look like. It doesn't mean that it, again, splits humans off as some kind of supernatural contrast set. That's not what happens here. It's a general model approach. But I'm just wondering if you've given any thought to what it would mean to use a 4E cognitive approach that dampens representational language talk with REM sleep patterns across species, humans and non-humans.
Yeah, so that's a tricky question, because you're right that often offline forms of mental processing, like dreams, things where there's just something happening internally, are often presented as potential critiques of the 4E framework, because it seems like there is something quote unquote purely mental and purely representational happening here. The question, of course, is what we mean by representation. And in connection to dreams, one of the big debates about dreams is, and especially once you extend it to animals, is if we're thinking about dreams as representations, what kinds of representations are they? When I dream something, and there are very different philosophical camps about this, is a dream like a belief? So for example, if I dream that I am flying, does that mean that I believe that I'm flying? Is a dream more like a hallucination? Is a dream more like an imagining? What kind of mental act is dreaming? And I tend to lean towards the imaginative theory of dreaming that foregrounds the production of imagery. And one of the things that happens when you start thinking about thought as linguistic is that it does separate you a little bit from most mainstream ways of thinking about what representation, mental representation means, which usually has some linguistic component to it. And so in the case of dreams, and I talk about this in one of the chapters of the book without referencing the 4E framework, is that you do not need linguistic representation in order to have complex mental states. And the way you get that is through imagination. And so other animals don't need language or linguistically structured thought patterns in order to have complex inner experiences, because those can be given, quote unquote, pictorially through the creation of episodes, through scenes, through feelings, through affects. But I do not yet know how I would try to reconcile a theory of dreaming with a 4E framework, although I am working on a paper on the 4E framework, not connected to dreams, but thinking about what the 4E framework can do for us in terms of thinking about the experience of animals in laboratories. And so that's a slightly different line of research. Once you think about the 4Es, laboratories, as we've heard, start appearing as shockingly impoverished environments for the production of experience.
Thank you for that. I wanted to push you a little bit on your ethical teaser. I wondered what work for you the language of dreams is doing for you in comparison, say, the language of suffering or sentience when it comes to moral standing, because you offered it as a alternative, but I can see it's not a capabilities alternative. So yeah, could you just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the term here that probably is most useful is sentience, although the actual term that I use and that I take from the philosophical literature is phenomenal consciousness. And phenomenal consciousness is the kind of experience that happens below the threshold of concepts, below the threshold of reason, below the threshold of language, and that gives us a kind of experience of the world that maybe doesn't rise to the level of that, like rational thought. And what I do in that final chapter, to try to break down the argument very briefly, is I say, most ethical theorists agree that there are some entities out there in the world that trigger a kind of moral alarm, right? There are some things that you shouldn't do to certain kinds of beings that we wouldn't care if you do to a pen. And so what's that difference? For me, that difference is this concept of phenomenal consciousness. And the basic philosophical insight there is that what grants moral significance to an organism is its capacity to sense and feel. So it foregrounds affect, it foregrounds sensation, and it foregrounds phenomenality, just the appearance of a phenomenal world for that creature, even if that world, again, doesn't have rational concepts and numbers and words, etc. And so the argument that I make in connection to dreams is that if you're wondering which animals have that phenomenal consciousness, there are many ways to get there. One of them is dreams, because dreams by definition, and there are some theories of dream that I use for making this argument, in many ways they are the quintessential phenomenal state. Again, because they're not rational, they're not conceptually tight in the way that maybe the discussion that we're having here hopefully is. And so dreams, really what makes them significant is that there is a kind of rush of feeling and sensation. And for me, that's the foundation of ethics. And it's slightly different than the emphasis on more classical conceptions of suffering that you get, for instance, in utilitarian ethics. It just operates maybe one step below that.
Hi, David. Great talk. I'll preface my comment with the fact that I've been out of the sleep field for a few years now, but I had the unique and wonderful opportunity to study marine mammal sleep physiology for several years. So I think you may have started to allude to it in maybe one of your slides before with regards to the Q&A about the various different species. So some marine mammals are really unique in that they don't show any of the EEG or physiological signs of REM sleep. So for example, dolphins. Just wanted to hear your thoughts with regards to the variety of animals that don't actually dream or show what we know or perceive as the characteristics of REM sleep and dreaming.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I wish retrospectively I had dealt with in more detail in the book is just the fascinating diversity of sleep architectures that happen in nature. Animals sleep in all kinds of ways. Some birds sleep while they're flying. Other animals change their sleep cycle based on the season. There are as many sleep architectures as there are, well, maybe not quite, but almost as there are species. Some animals sleep in very short bursts of time, like a 2-minute nap, like birds. Others, like cats, spend, as many of you know, a lot of time in REM sleep. They're the ones that spend the most time in REM sleep in the animal kingdom. And there are some that have sleep architectures that are just so bizarre that we don't know what to do with. And a good example of that is cetaceans. In the case of cetaceans, there are two complications. From our perspective, it's not a complication, obviously, for them. They're living their lives. One complication is that we have difficulty interpreting the behavior of the quote-unquote oneric behaviors of cetaceans because their morphology is just very different, right? You don't have the same kind of limb structure, the same kind of movement, and the same kind of emphasis on facial grimaces. And so we just don't really know what to do when we see them maybe move a little bit in their sleep cycle. Although I'll note that there is a bit of an ongoing debate in the cetacean sleep literature between some people who say, yes, we're noticing a version of REM sleep, and other people who are saying, we don't find it anywhere. And so because that's a contested issue, I decided not to touch it. I saw it as not my place to resolve that empirical question, and so better to stay away from that. The second thing that complicates the case of cetacean sleep is that dolphins have unihemispherical sleep, and that means that when they fall asleep, only one hemisphere sleeps while the other one is awake. We don't have a human analog for that, at least not normally. There are some cases of split brain that people argue could give us a point of comparison. But even just conceptually, it kind of tests the limits of our imagination. Because if half of the brain is asleep and possibly going into a dream state, and the other one is awake and interacting with the world, how do we make sense of the experience of those animals? Is it that the dream world and the waking world are superimposed onto one another? Are they blending? Is it sort of like down the visual field, like half dream over here, half waking experience? Really hard to know. And in fact, it's impossible not to be speculative about it. But even that I find really fascinating. And it's just that right now we don't have enough empirical or even I would say philosophical resources to really make any concrete claims about those cases. Yeah.
Okay, we lost that top corner. Perhaps here on the left at the beginning, Angela has a question here.
I'm sorry, who?
Yeah, Angela.
Thanks a lot, Amy. Hi, thank you so much. I just wanted to pick up on that last point you just made about how it's impossible not to be speculative about the non-human animals dreaming. And I wondered here, part of the reason I was kind of attracted to your work and your book was because I was thinking, for humans, maybe this is just because I'm not a scientist, I'm a law professor, so I don't really understand anything about, human sleep and human dreaming. But it seems to me that there's aspects of it that we probably don't really understand very well. If we just think about like the subconscious and how you can kind of, feed your subconscious with hypnosis and those sorts of things. I think anyone who's kind of messed around with that at all, you kind of realize, wow, that's very, very powerful. And so, is there a sense in which our inability to understand how our own dream state works is kind of like a building connection sameness type of a thing, in the sense that we can see for other animals, it's very similar actually, that kind of not really knowing.
Yeah. So you're right that there is still a lot that we don't understand about dreams. And this is something that dream researchers will themselves readily grant, that, why we dream, how the dream is formed. We know some things about the material formation of dreams through neuroscience, but the mystery of dreams in a larger philosophical sense is still very much an open question. And so there is a necessarily speculative dimension that applies even to our own relationship to our dreams. Even thinking about the notion of the unconscious that you alluded to, why do we dream the things that we dream, and what do they tell us about our emotions, about our mental state? And the notion of the unconscious proved particularly useful for me in the book. Another one on which the scientific editorial team gave me some pushback, because I used the concept of the unconscious, especially when thinking about animal nightmares. There's a whole section in the book that I didn't talk about what happens in cases of extreme trauma, where that trauma gets buried, or we could say repressed, and then erupts in the context of a dream for animals, either in the form of a nightmare or in the form of a night terror. We have a lot of, we have some research about that. I should not say a lot because it's not, in connection to rats, in connection to apes, in connection to elephants. Those are the three species about which I found some backing for thinking about nightmares. But yeah, so this is what I like about dreams, that they do push you to, again, deepen your thinking about how complex these other creatures are, to the point that, what is a mystery for us is also a mystery for them, and even to the point that it brings us to something like the concept of the unconscious.
Just behind you, yes. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Gina. I'm from Mexico. Your book is really interesting. I'm gonna buy it, but I actually do have some doubts. Do you happen to have any information regarding the function of or dreaming of the dogs? I'm asking this because in the understanding that dogs are the most domestic animals related to humans, I'm curious about if they happen to connect something with their daily life, or if how they dream. Or, for example, in my case, I rescue mistreated dogs. So in this scenario, do they happen to relive, replay, or dream about again what happened to them? Because I do know that some of them get a long-term trauma, which is very difficult to treat, but possible. So in this understanding, I would just like to know if there's anything related or anything you can say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there are a lot of theories about the function of dreaming, period, out there. There is no consensus among scientists about what it is that dreams do for us. Sometimes those theories are classified into the evolutionary ones that focus on deep evolutionary time, the origin of dreams, and their emergence in various species. And then you have the psychological theories that foreground what dreaming does for the particular animal. And usually in that branch of that classificatory scheme, the psychological theories will foreground things like memory consolidation as a function of dreaming, that when we dream of things, it's a way of reinforcing a particularly important memory, and perhaps a memory that has been stamped, say by our limbic system, as emotionally significant. And that can be emotionally significant for positive reasons, because it's something that we really like, as in the case of the rats and their desired rice, or something that's been stamped as emotionally destructive, as in the case of trauma. So whatever experiences we have, if they have a strong emotional valence to them, they are likely to reappear in dreams. And this is what some people call the emotional metabolization function of dreams, that they help us process particularly affective affects, if that makes sense. And the other thing that I would say here is that often also people talk about dreams as ways of problem solving during sleep, because you make new connections when you're dreaming, hence the bizarre kind of weirdness of dreams. And so it might be that in dreaming all these scenarios, animals are problem solving and sort of like exercising their creativity muscle at a cognitive level. But one of the things that happened since the publication of the book is that I've received dozens and dozens of emails from people who share their experience with their domestic companions, telling me, you know, my cat suffered a dog attack 10 years ago, and they wake up screaming in the middle of the night every night. So there are a lot of anecdotes of the role, especially that trauma plays in the formation of dreams for particular animals. Yeah. Thanks.
Perfect. Let's move towards the middle, third row. First question.
Thank you for this talk. Sorry, I scared you.
Oh, no.
Thank you so much. It was really fascinating. I'm not a philosopher, but I wrote a PhD thesis that's kind of half philosophy, half law. And some of the backlash I got when I talked to philosophers about, for example, understanding personhood more as a cluster concept, like, for example, art. So like a list of weighted criteria where none of the criteria is either necessary or sufficient. And also focusing that personhood developed in history as first belonging to a unique individual. And that means that individuals are different, but you respect the differences, because you're a unique individual. And being a unique individual, for me, means, for example, having personality traits, imagination, like all these different concepts that have been kind of forgotten when people talk about personhood, because they focus on these abstract concepts like rationality. And so it seems to me that a lot of times philosophers focus on those to kind of maintain the border that separates human persons from non-human persons. But actually, personhood is not only that, but much more. Even if we could talk about, for example, humor. if we find, not to say that persons are only those who have humor, because a lot of us wouldn't be persons, you know?
Some of us are boring.
Exactly, some of us are just boring. But humor as dreams is important because it indicates that you have memory, imagination, that even maybe a theory of mind, or that you can put yourself in the place of other to play a trick. And there's a lot of accounts of humor and cetaceans and great apes and different species of animals. So have you gotten a lot of backlash from philosophers because this would broaden the moral status to beings that are very different from humans? Because, I don't know, I've even read research on jumping spiders being able to dream. So how has it been in the philosophical community for you with this?
Yeah, so I'm happy to say that the response has been largely positive. The one point of pressure that I've received from philosophers in writing is an appeal to this notion that, look, the dreams of animals are just inaccessible, so leave it alone. This is not a place where you can arrive at the kinds of conclusions that you want with any high level of certainty. But I am aware that I won't get the level of certainty that maybe we would get in other spaces, but that's precisely why I wrote this book, because I think that there is something here to be said. So not a lot of negative pushback in connection to that. One thing that I have been asked a lot is the question of line drawing. Where do you draw the line ultimately between dreamers and non-dreamers? And as I say in the book, I don't have an answer to that. What I can say is that if we put all the evidence on the table and start doing some sorting of a rough and general way, it's a lot of animals. It's a lot of animals. And there is some really interesting research happening now. For instance, you mentioned the jumping spiders by Daniela Rosser from Germany. That research came out like a month after I published the book. So it didn't make it in because it didn't exist. But now arthropods, which appear nowhere in my book, are suddenly on that table too as candidates for discussion. There are a couple of researchers out of Australia who are looking at the reemergence of certain inner patterns in earthworms during periods of rest. That's really taking us to a kind of limit where even I feel myself kind of like, my philosophically more adventurous side wants to say, let's go there. Then maybe my more conservative side that I've internalized from my discipline says, hit the brakes a little bit. And so I do have some tension about some of those lines. But if I were to say, mammals, the clearest case. We have a lot of evidence also for birds. We have fish. We have cephalopods, which just evolutionarily speaking are, on different ends. We're talking about different taxa. And so dreaming is something that either appears in different branches of the tree of life independently at multiple times, and that's fascinating, or it's something so archaic that we share it even before our split with octopuses, which are mollusks. And so either way, we're talking about a fundamental shift in our way of thinking about animality itself.
Actually, the case of earthworms, I wouldn't feel so skeptic about them because here we have When Animals Dream. Eva Meyer wrote When Animals Speak. And in that one, she discusses, so Darwin had an 1881 study on earthworms where he speaks of earthworms as having agency because they decide to pick leaves from the top, the bottom, or the middle, depending on the size, the flexibility of the leaf, and the function of the leaf in the tunnels that they are building. So they seem to make decisions. I don't know if this is connected to dreaming, that when one makes decisions that might, lead one. But I don't know, because perhaps here this is related to, you also do a lot of work on neuroscience. So maybe they don't have the neural capacities. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so the question is, what is a dream?
Right.
And at what point does it cease resembling what we think of as a dream? And is that a problem with the phenomenon or with our expectation that it should look like what we expect it to look like? And so for the moment, my rule of thumb is to follow the leads, the earthworm research is not out yet. I keep waiting for it to see what happens. So my rule of thumb will be to follow the trail and see what happens without foreclosing it from the beginning. So I'm very much open to that.
No, yeah. That's great. Okay, so let's go to the right hand side, perhaps there at the very end. This part. Yeah, right.
Hi. My question is kind of what is it like to be a cat? So I was struck by, obviously I know that cats sleep a lot because I have cats. I didn't know that they had tons of REM sleep, and it made me wonder what proportion of our phenomenal lives happens while we're asleep, and is that very different in other species? Like what proportion of a cat's phenomenal experience actually happens while they're sleeping? Are you able to say that?
I was able to say that at some point when I was doing the research for this, but they do spend a lot more time than we do. I mean, if we think about an 8-hour sleep cycle for humans, that's a third of our, the 8-8-8 model of 8 hours work, 8-hour leisure, 8-hour sleep. Cats spend more than that. This is an invention on the spot. I would say 12 to 14, but I really have to double check that. And so, yeah, it is a very significant feature of the experience of a lot of animals, just in terms of the raw number of minutes or hours. But I would not want to equate the significance to the length of time, because one of the things I mentioned is that there are other species that sleep a lot less, and I wouldn't want to discount the significance of their dream lives on that account. I just wonder what you dream about if you're asleep all the time. Yeah. Well, in the case of cats, the French neuroscientist Michel Jouvet, who is a well-known dream researcher, he said that dreams entered neuroscience in the 20th century through the domestic cat. And that's because some of the earliest research on REM sleep was done on cats in France. And what happened is that Jouvet wanted to figure out if there's really something happening inside the animals, like a real experience, a complex, unified narrative of action and reaction with social dynamics. Because what we see at the level of oneric behaviors is sometimes quite fragmented, right? Sometimes you see the animals run. Okay, that's indicative. But sometimes the behaviors are, they leave a lot to be desired, like a little twitch here, a little twitch there, don't know what to do. And he decided to, and this is, this raises important ethical questions about the history of dream research itself. He conducted a series of studies where he cut out a part of the brainstem in these cats, which is what brings into play a state of atonia during sleep. So when we are asleep, we lose tonus. And when you take that out of the equation, it means that the animals can fall asleep, they can go into REM sleep, but they still have control over their bodies. And so they're not physically asleep, they're not immobile. And what these cats began to do, and you can find the original footage of this on YouTube, is they started fully acting out their dreams. They started fighting with imaginary enemies in the air. And they started sometimes copulating with imaginary partners. And so this was interpreted as the liberation of that dream sequence that is normally kept in by the physiology of sleep. But the cat and dream historically are quite connected.
Let's go back to the top, in the middle left, more or less.
Thank you for that talk. It's very, very interesting. And I preface my question by saying I'm not a philosopher at all. But going back to the fact that animal dreams, and probably humans too, we extract from our memory, imagination, and our desire. And I'm curious, the first part of my question is, would you classify, basic instincts as that same category as desire, the lack of something that moves you? So, the need to perform basic instincts from animals. And if so, hypothetically, because we know that avians can dream, and we know that specifically chickens have been proven to dream. So my hypothetical situation is, if we have a laying hen stuck in a battery cage who's never known any sort of life outside that battery cage, but would still have this instinctive desire to fly, could that bird, in theory, have those sorts of dreams, or do we simply not know this yet?
We don't know this, but it is conceivable that if you accept that animals have instincts, and actually my view on this has shifted. For some time, I resisted the notion of instinct because I thought it reduced a lot of animal behavior to, again, that kind of mechanical reaction triggered by the presence of a stimulus. And I recently read a book that sort of changed my mind about this in terms of thinking about instinct and impulses maybe in a richer way, of animals carrying with them, again, this archaic past in them, that they, just like us, we carry some of those tendencies from our past that we don't know what to do with the moment that they get activated. The question is whether those appear in dreams. And if you are of a psychoanalytic Freudian inclination, and I have my moments, you are very much open to that possibility. In fact, Freud believed that we dream a lot of impulses and instincts, and we work them out in our dreams. So that is certainly possible, but but with this caveat that it remains speculative. And there are many parts of the book where I enter into this kind of territory, and I always try to flag, like, the next point I'm about to make goes beyond the empirical data. It's conceivable, but we need to kind of mark the kind of claim that it is.
Yes, let's stay on the top left now. Left-hand side, please. The corner of questions. Have all asked.
Okay, this is a very poorly formed question, but I've been thinking about it for the past hour. So this morning, of course, we heard this amazing presentation about social norms and two amazing presentations about that. But now we come to yours, and I had the sense that maybe there is some connection between social norms and dreaming, and maybe there's not. But I wanted to at least ask the question, because if I take myself as an example, which is not, of course, scientific in any way, I often dream about violating social norms, coming to class late, showing up to teach dressed inappropriately, right? And all these things in which things that are embarrassing or violate somehow social expectations. So that's my best effort to draw a connection between the first and yours. But maybe you have something else to say about how or not there is some relationship at any level of the universe. And maybe our first speaker here has something.
No, I think you're pointing to something that's actually quite significant, because one thing to underline about dreams is that for a long time, in the late 19th century and for the first half of the 20th century, people thought of dreams as just white noise. You fall asleep, your brain is doing kind of like pirouettes, but they don't mean anything. Don't try to interpret them. They won't tell you anything about you, about your psychology, about your emotions, etc. In the 1970s and 80s, there is a sudden shift in dream research as people start realizing, for example, that the limbic process associated with the processing of emotions is actually deeply implicated in dreaming. And so dreams do reveal something about you, because we tend to dream, again, of things that concern us, of things that get stamped as positive or negative and that linger in some way. And this is a shift that we've already made in the study of dreams, in the study of human dreams without any problem. We now recognize that you actually can kind of interpret dreams because they reflect your concerns, your fears. Some of those fears might be fears that come from the things happening to you in the day or the 2 days before the dream. A big event happens, we dream of it often. But it also could be that we dream maybe of those older, maybe more archaic, evolutionary, primal fears that we have. Fears of snakes, fears of drowning, whatever the case might be. And so if we accept a version of that claim in connection to humans, I don't think that it's off the table for other animals. The problem is that we have very limited access to the content of the dreams of other animals. The kind of content that I talked about is usually limited to musical notes that trigger very specific neural signatures in birds, spatial representations in rodents because of how much we know about the memory system and hippocampal cells, and nightmares, where we do see some clear indicators of past trauma. Beyond that, and this goes back to this question of sameness versus difference and respecting the fact that there will be limits that we maybe will never be able to traverse, it might be that we will never know for other animals. And maybe that's a reason to care about this issue even more, because it's a limit to our human desire for mastery and for control and for totalization. Yeah.
Well, let's go here on the left because this lady has been waiting for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for your presentation. In regards to the ethics, my question was going to, now that you have seen or spoken or done some research for your book, I guess we all come to the agreement that all those studies were done from an anthropocentric point of view, mainly like us humans trying to understand and trying to being curious with like all these animals that are having these experiences. And I guess, as you mentioned, like we will never be able to understand fully in a scientific point of view, like fully 100% what is it that happens when animals sleep. Do you think that though it has had an effect with scholars and scientists to, I guess that's the only way to empathize with animals when it comes to their exploitation and their suffering? Like, do you see any change in the scientific field or a scholar field when it comes to respecting them more? I guess that's the easier way of putting it.
Do you mean a change since the publication of the book?
Since
I would love to say yes, but
see, from the moment, I guess, where we are understanding better, I guess, throughout the years.
I see. So I do think social views are changing in general about the role of animals in mixed species societies, and we see that in changes to the law in various countries. There are new debates that maybe several years ago even would have been slightly unthinkable. We've had a number of cases in the US that have pushed, for example, questions of personhood into the foreground. In Spain, there's been an animal welfare law that's caused a lot of debate in the last year that furthers welfare protections for animals in really interesting ways. And so there are shifts that are happening. A lot of what we've talked about today has been law, but also science. And even in science, I see a shift also happening. Although the shift, I have to say, sadly, I interpret it as largely generational. I do think it has to do with maybe older scientists that are more entrenched in their ways of thinking and in their practices leaving, and newer scientists who are much more open to different ways of doing science coming in. But because that process takes decades of changing the actual demographics of science, I suspect we will see a pretty significant change, hopefully in about 15 to 20 years. But I don't know how optimistic I'm being in holding that belief. But yeah, I think there are reasons for for optimism, but there are also other areas where maybe we're not quite doing as well. Yeah. I'll be vague about that, about that last point.
That's fantastic. There are quite a few more questions, but it's 5 o'clock exactly right now. So thank you so much, David, for this wonderful talk and for this wonderful and stimulating conversation that we had afterwards.
Thank you.